Unique people leading unique lives shape and inform Iowa City. This community is enhanced by these women and men who live in our midst, working, teaching, creating. Welcome to a series of conversations with people who have stories to tell. Join my guests and me, Ellen Buchanan, in a series of interviews called One of a Kind. Margaret Alexander is the principal investigator and American director of the project for the corpus of the mosaics of Tunisia. A retired University of Iowa professor of Greek, Roman, and early Christian art, Professor Alexander has for a quarter century been working with an international team in Tunisia to trace the history of ancient mosaics. She lectures here and abroad on this subject. Professor Alexander not only studies the intricate mosaics, but works to conserve them. Margaret and her husband Robert came to Iowa City in 1961 to teach at the university. She in the classics department and he in the School of Art and Art History. Due to their many travels abroad to study art and architectural history of distant places, students taking their courses have acquired new understandings and stretched their imaginations. In 1986, she served as the American representative for the 2,800th anniversary of the founding of Carthage, Tunis. In 1994, Margaret received a Medal of Cultural Merit from the Tunisian government. She is president of the International Committee for the Conservation of Mosaics, Deputy Secretary General of the International Association of the Study of Ancient Mosaics, and is a consultant for the Getty Conservation Institute. Professor Alexander has written numerous articles and publications. She and her husband have two daughters, Margaret and Harriet, and one grandson. Welcome to One of a Kind.
Yeah.
Before we get into your many travels and mosaics, I want to talk about your early years and the influence of your first family. I know you were born in May 1916 back east in Massachusetts, Sharon, but you grew up in New Hampshire. Tell me about this.
Right. Well, my father was a superintendent of schools, so that he didn't always stay in one place, though we did stay in New Hampshire for a very long time. First in a town called Marlborough, and then in Wilton, where my family lived until, my parents lived until they died. And I went to school there from second grade on through high school. Our class was the largest at that time, which was 25 people. And then I went to college at Wheaton College in Massachusetts. From there, I went to New York University to the Institute of Fine Arts to do my master's degree in art history. Then worked at Wheaton College for a couple of years, went to Dumbarton Oaks, which is a center for Byzantine studies, where I was a fellow for 3 years, then went back and finished a PhD, where I met my husband.
Okay, I want to go back to your early years in New Hampshire. You had these grandparents who lived off the coast of Maine, and you would go visit them.
That's right.
That sounds so kind of exotic, to go off the coast to visit your grandparents.
Well, my father's parents, whom I didn't know because one had died before I was born and one when I was 2 years old, lived on the island of North Haven, which is about 10 miles off Rockport, Maine. My mother's parents lived on Seal Harbor, Mount Desert Island, at a town called Seal Harbor, where they apparently had lived for generations.
What did he do on this island?
Well, he ran a fish market for a while. He was the boat master, but there was a steamboat that came from, I guess it came up from Boston, but I used to get on in Rockland and then go up. And he used to blow his foghorn, which was a huge conch shell, which I still have, and I can blow. And it really makes quite a noise. I don't know really what else he did. He owned lots and lots of land on the island and sold to the Rockefellers and Fords. But what he did as a young man, I don't know.
Margaret, when you were young, was being an art historian something you thought seriously about? Or I read that you were interested in architecture.
I first wanted to be an architect. And this was at a very bad time in the United States. And the man who was teaching chemistry and physics in our high school was an architect. He was teaching it because he could not earn a living as an architect. So when I talked to him about going into architecture, he said no. And certainly at that time, not for a woman. This was still very much a closed field for women in the, when was that, in the 30s.
Well, what made you decide to go into art history?
Well, when I went to college, I don't know. I don't know what made me think I wanted to be an architect. I have no idea. But when I went to college, I realized that I wanted to get into archaeology. Now, we didn't have such a department in my college. There was one course, and the choice was between taking art history courses or taking Latin and Greek, and I chose art history. And so didn't really get into archaeology until we started this project in Tunisia.
Well, tell me about your work. After you graduated from New York University Institute of Fine Arts in 1941, you became a fellow at Dumbarton Oaks Center for Byzantine Studies in Washington, D.C., and you were doing some important work because of the bombing.
Well, we had our own. We were there, of course, primarily to do our own research, and also to work on a joint project that all the art historians worked on, and all the historians worked on another project. And I'll come back to that because that's really how I got into North Africa. But yes, it was, of course, during the war, and this was an unusual chance, of course, to sit in an ivory tower while everybody else was battling away. And you began to feel as though this wasn't quite fair. Fortunately, there was dumped into my lap the chance to do something for the war effort, which was, again, in the field of art history, because what the United States and lots of other countries were concerned about was all the bombing that was going on in Europe at that time, and presumably would in other countries as well, and how much of the great works of architecture particularly, or museums with works of art in them, would be destroyed by the bombs. So I think that I was one of the very first to be asked to write a sort of handbook. And I was asked to do it for Tunisia, since that's the country I was working on then at Dumbarton Oaks, to give a kind of little cultural guide. What, for example, was their religion and so on, but then also to stress what were the buildings that were important to them, culturally, religiously, in any way, what were the really significant ones. And we were asked to grade these buildings so that you gave a 3-star to ones that you hoped they really would miss if they could possibly do it, and on down, and others you just talked about. Well, because there was a particular ruin that was especially significant for my research, I thought, well, I'll give it 3 stars. It'd be too bad if that one got destroyed. And when my husband and I went back soon after the war, we couldn't even find the building.
It had been leveled?
Well, it hadn't been damaged in the war. It's just that it was complete ruin then, and we just didn't get into the right part of the town. But I thought, how ironic. I put something as 3 stars. It wouldn't matter to anybody but me. But this went on to various other countries. Of course, Italy was such a large country that was divided up amongst a lot of people. And whether we did any good or not, I don't know. On the other hand, I know that when the troops went into a town called Spatla in Tunisia, in the fighting coming across from Algeria, they did not damage the ruins. When we went back, I could not see that they had hurt much of anything in the ruins. However, the town was pretty much devastated. Any major monument was gone. We had been put up in the hospital because the then French director of antiquities, called a hospital and said, we had sleeping bags, could they at least give us a cot to sleep on? But all down the main street were these little tiny buildings, squarish buildings with little domes, and those were standing. Those had not been destroyed. And we think because the soldiers thought that they're what are called marabouts, which are the buildings that are put up for holy men, for what they consider more or less saintly men in Tunisia. And so they didn't touch them. Actually, what they were was simply kiosks for buying bread, tobacco, newspapers, and so on. So maybe it had some effect.
Yeah.
I don't know. But this was a joint effort. It was run primarily from Harvard, and since Dumbarton Oaks is a part of Harvard University, it was natural that they got all of us who could work on these countries to do this. It was all very secret. We couldn't tell anybody what we were doing. And I said later, if I'd only been somewhat politically minded, I would have realized one of the first countries we were going into was those in North Africa. Never occurred to me.
And then here was the rest of the century you were working in Tunisia. Tell me, before we get to your work in Tunisia, after the war you went to New York University and got your doctorate in 1958, and by this time you were married to Robert. And how did you get to Iowa City?
Well, we came because my husband was offered a job here. And our daughters were waiting. We knew he'd gone to the College Art Association meetings. These are the big ones for art historians. And that he was looking for a job. We were then at Penn State. And he called back. He'd been talking about perhaps Ohio. And he called back and he said, well, I'm really getting interested in a job in Iowa. And my breath sort of went in, and I said to my daughter, Iowa? What does he want to go there for? Which hurt our younger daughter for years. She thought this was dreadful that we had come to Iowa because of that. But he came here, I am sure, would think about coming here only because several years earlier we had gone to Pittsburgh. I was working at the time for a woman, an art historian, who had been the head of the art department at Wellesley College. We were in New York. And she heard that Bob was considering a job in Pittsburgh. And she said, absolutely, in all seriousness, Margaret, you cannot let him go there. That is west of the Alleghenies. So it was quite a jump to come west of the Mississippi.
Now, are you going to tell me you're sorry you came?
Not at all.
Not at all.
Not
now,
at
but
all.
then you got a job, but you were an art historian, but at that time you thought that you couldn't both of you teach in the same department, or was there a ruling?
As far as the university was concerned, the rule. I think there were one or two little exceptions, perhaps in medicine, but I'm not sure. And it took a very long time before a woman who wanted a job in the music department, and whose husband was in the department, till she went through all kinds of papers and discovered that that law had been rescinded long ago. Well, you see, this is a state university, and during the Depression, if anyone worked for the government in any way, such as even teaching in a state school, only one member of a family could have such a job. And so it was a leftover from that time.
So the classics department hired you?
So it was decided that the classics department would theoretically take me on, and money was transferred to that department. So I stayed there until it was discovered that this was not necessary. And then it was suggested to me by Sandy Boyd that I go to the art one. And I said, it doesn't make any difference to anybody. These classics people have been wonderful to me. I would just as soon stay
So
as
you
part
did.
of that. The only drawback is that you then have not just meetings in one department. You have two.
Two meetings.
It's a little much.
But you did get to travel a lot.
We
didn't
traveled
you?
beginning about 1965. We traveled.
All right, now, before we go any further, I want you to explain what a mosaic is. I mean, we all kind of know what mosaics are, but I mean that you have been studying these for over a quarter century.
Longer than that.
Longer than that. Okay, tell us why they speak to you and the allure and the importance of mosaics.
Well, You know, when one does a PhD dissertation, often you don't yourself know exactly what you want to do. I did know that I wanted to continue working in the North African field. So my professor suggested, why not work on a type of mosaic which is not unique to North Africa, but has hundreds more than anywhere else. And these are mosaics that were slabs that were used as covers for tombs. Or they lay in the floor of a church or a cemetery, and the actual tomb was beneath, so that they would give you the name of the person. Sometimes they would say fidelis in pace, that they were faithful and that they were in peace, or little phrases like that. They would tell you how old the person was, and if it was a child, there would be year, month, day, and a child sometimes hours old, but it wouldn't tell you the year they died, rarely. Out of, well, I suppose now going on towards 800 or 900 of such mosaics, I would say less than 20 have any real secure date. So I got started on this was suggested to me, so that when a friend of mine called up one day and said, you know, there is something that was called foreign currency money. This was Public Law 480, which developed after the war because so many countries had received all kinds of help from the U.S. government. In Tunisia, for example, it was primarily by way of grain, agricultural commodities of all sorts, so that those countries really owed the United States a lot of money. Well, a country like Tunisia, which is a soft currency, had no way of paying back the United States in money. So it's paid back by supporting first the embassy, other service organizations of the United States government, and all kinds of people doing research in Tunisia. So it was suggested, well, maybe we could have a corpus of mosaics of Tunisia, and if so, would I be willing to direct the project? So that's how I got started there. Though we had been there, we did visit there just after the war, while I was working on my dissertation, to see those mosaics.
So tell us the different kinds of mosaics. What all the different things we can expect to see on a
Well,
mosaic?
if you go, for example, to Tunisia, actually there was an exhibition of mosaics here a few years ago from Tunisia. It was the year of what must have been 1976, because it was part of the centennial, not centennial, but our birthday. And there was an exhibition going around the country, and I asked this museum if we could possibly have it, and they took it on. Well, there are all kinds. If you go to Tunisia, if you go to any country where the Romans have been, or the Greeks, there are Greek mosaics even earlier than Roman ones, but I know primarily Roman mosaics. And you will see them in the museums, on the floors of museums, on the walls. In fact, the so-called Bardo Museum in Tunis has the world's largest collection of mosaics. And they are all over. But most of them in Tunisia were floor mosaics. Now, there may well have been mosaics on the walls, but so many, almost all of the monuments are so damaged that there's almost nothing left. Once in a while, you'll see a piece of a vault that's fallen, and you'll see the imprint, perhaps, of the little stones or glass that were used, but not much of anything else. So what we're dealing with almost entirely are floor mosaics. That is, they are a kind of permanent carpet. Beautiful, decorative, or figural carpet.
Tell a story? Do some of them tell a story?
Oh, that definitely. Mostly mythological stories. But one of the peculiarities or particularities of the Tunisian mosaics is that they show many scenes of everyday life. They show people fishing, they show them hunting, particularly hunting and fishing. Once in a while you'll see somebody swimming. They show scenes at a banquet, for example. Almost anything that went on.
And history-wise, we're talking about AD?
We're talking, yes. For the Roman mosaics, we're talking perhaps in some places, perhaps at our first site of Utica, the end of the 1st century AD through till the Arabs come in the end of the 7th century and the 8th century. When actually a few mosaics have been found dating as late as the 10th century, but the Arabs went to tiles rather than to these mosaics of little tiny pieces of stone. Because you see, since so many of these are floor mosaics, they are made, of course, of material that can't be damaged easily. That is, they're made of stone, almost entirely. They will be made of limestone, marble, sometimes something like slate, but a variety, mostly kind of limestone and marble, sometimes glass.
What keeps them in place? What keeps them?
Well, this is an elaborate process. You see, you have your building built, you have your walls up, and then you have a good, strong foundation for that house, let's say, or bath, or whatever it happens to be. Then you lay another, you actually lay 2 layers on top of that. The very bottom one, which is huge pieces of stone, so that it will be good and firm and hard. On top of that, you lay what is called a rudis. That is, we use the Latin term that Vitruvius used. And this is a mixture of smaller pebbles and lime and sand, which then solidifies. When that's solid, you put another, usually thinner layer, and actually you can see it on this mosaic. This is essentially what we call the nucleus, which is then much finer pebbles and sand and lime. And if you want to waterproof it, you add crushed tiles, brick or ceramic, probably reusing broken pots. Then on top of them, when that's solid, you put on a very thin layer of lime, sometimes mixed with sand, sometimes mixed with marble dust, and into that you push, one by one, these little tiny pieces of stone. And those stones can vary. These look small, but when they want to make a picture, they used to make separate pictures made in the workshop and then taken and laid into the floor of a house. And they would usually be small. These could be anywhere from 2 millimeters to 5 or 6 or 7 millimeters in size. They're absolutely tiny.
And it tells you what they were interested in,
That's
what
right.
they valued, their activities. It's a
And what they thought of themselves as intellectuals, cultural people. You know, by the 4th, 5th century, we don't know how much they understood of some of these myths that they were representing. Some certainly did, but probably a lot didn't. But it was the thing to do. This was a status symbol to have these, because figural mosaics are rare compared to the decorative ones. There are lots of geometric mosaics, some of just in black and white, but by the 2nd century, more and more they became polychrome. But into these would sometimes be set or made along with it, because these floor mosaics were made in situ. The people went to the buildings and put their little tesserae, as they're called, these little squares of stone, into them. So that when we've tried to figure out what's the percentage of figural mosaics compared to decorative ones, we discovered that in the 3 sites we've worked on, about 8% only were figural. Now you go into a museum and that's mostly what you see, so that you think that was the taste. But only the really wealthy could afford something like that.
How have you been received in Tunis, in Tunisia? And I
Been
know you have a
welcomed.
co-director.
Yes, I've had, at the beginning, I had a man who was director of the Bardo Museum and something of an archaeologist himself, with whom I worked up until fairly recently. Then I have a woman co-director, Aisha Benabed, who is quite an extraordinary woman, who manages to do all kinds of things, plus have 3 children. She has something I find unusual in Tunisia, an extraordinarily supportive husband who works with the children every night over their classwork. She doesn't, he does. And while there are getting more and more Arab men who have wives who work and who do support them, his is really quite extraordinary, because she has to go away for weeks at a time and he takes care of the children.
What did you tell me about your 2 children? Here you are in Tunis, and your husband is traveling all over, and you have these. Tell me about your two daughters, and
Well,
did they go along?
Our older daughter, Margaret, is in Botswana at the moment, in a place called Gaborone, which is the capital of Botswana. She is a lawyer with the Agency for International Development. She's been doing this now for about 7.5, going on to 8 years. She started first in West Africa, which she loved. She was in Abidjan, and then she has several countries in her job that she travels to about every 2 weeks or so. And we visited her there twice and traveled to Mali and to Ghana and Togo and Benin. Then she was transferred to Swaziland, which is down north of, or close to South Africa, abuts on South Africa, where we stayed but traveled a great deal in South Africa with her, driving down the coast and back up the middle to visit her. And now this January we plan to go to Botswana to visit her. She's reconsidering. She finds that the lawyering part of it is not very interesting. It's mostly sort of contract law, but she loves to travel and meeting all of these different kinds of people. Our younger daughter has been mostly a cook. She's been a caterer here in Iowa City. She's cooked in several restaurants. Then she married and went out to Seattle, Washington, and was there a cook and in charge of the kitchen, where they prepared meals for 1,000 school children, lunches for 1,000 school children. Then she decided, no, she wanted to go back to school. She hadn't finished university, so she finished here and started her master's degree in social work.
And you have a grandson?
And we have a grandson, Alexander, who prefers, of course, to be called Alex, who is now in 7th grade.
Tell me, Margaret, of your contributions of research and conserving and history and teaching. Are there some that have really meant the most to you? Or something that, or is it hard to pick out an area of your work?
Well, I suppose it is. On the other hand, having been someone who's loved stones all my life and collected stones all my life, maybe it seemed logical that I would go to work on mosaics, though I'd really thought I was going to work on architecture. But we have to do both, because these are in buildings, so we have to try to relate them to buildings, and also trying to, what's really exciting is trying to see, is there a kind of program in these floor decorations? How do they adapt pictorial and geometric and floral compositions and motifs to particular shapes of floors and kinds of floors? That is, what do they put in corridors as opposed to just small rooms? What do they put in the dining rooms, for example? In one case, we have a wonderful one of animals with their legs tied together, animals, birds, and then around them, fish. It's a pictorial menu. It tells you what they liked to eat.
There's a little mystery to them, isn't there?
There is, because for so many of them you can't explain. We can explain them what the myth is all about. We don't really too much know what it meant to some of these people. Certainly to some, they knew exactly what they wanted out of it. Some of them would represent, say, Dionysus. It was the god of fertility and wine, and a kind of immortality almost he represents, so that you get some idea. But this part of it, though I find I'm drawn particularly to the geometric and floral mosaics.
How have the Tunisians felt about you as an American taking the mosaics and taking them out of their context and putting them in a museum? Or is that...
I don't think that the Tunisians as such think too much one way or another about whether they're left in place or whether they go to museums. But certainly, most everyone now who works on mosaics prefers to try to leave them in place. But this is an extremely expensive project. Also, we don't even yet have the best means of preserving them in place. If you cannot put a structure back over them, they're going to go. You get the least crack in a mosaic and plants grow up in between. The mosaic goes like that, just bursts apart. Or what was hideous to see this summer when I was working down in El Jem with Bob, and we were restudying the mosaics because I'm about to publish that book, where they had been lifted and put into cement, but reinforced concrete, which meant with iron bars, which had not been treated. Those iron bars are now covered with rust, and we saw the mosaics coming up like this. Whole lines where the rod had been is now just cement in the mosaic, because it's absolutely broken the mosaics apart. Now you can use iron rods, but you have to treat them. But this is why we have this committee for conservation of mosaics. What are the best ways to go about it? And there are several that are being tried. But certainly, if you want to preserve them, you've got to have a cover over them.
Now, I know you're retired, Margaret, but you're not really.
Well,
Tell me, my last question is, you're going back to Tunisia and continue your work, correct?
Well, I'm going back to Tunisia this spring to work on the publication of the Carthage material we've been working on with my co-director. She and I may have another project we want to work on. We have one we want to work on together. Whether we will or not is another question. But I am retiring from the Corpus project as soon as the Carthage book is published.
Well, I wish you luck, and it's been a pleasure having you on my show.
Thank you. It's been a great pleasure for me, too.
My guest on One of a Kind has been art historian Professor Margaret Alexander. For 35 years plus, Iowa City has been her home. Her special interest is cataloging and preserving the history of ancient mosaics. She is the principal investigator and American director of the Corpus of the Mosaics of Tunisia. Margaret has been the recipient of numerous scholarships, fellowships, awards, and grants. Her professional life as a researcher, author, editor, consultant, and teacher has taken her from the banks of the Iowa River to the shores of the Mediterranean, from the quiet sidewalks of a college town to the teeming streets in Tunis in northern Africa. She is a world traveler and a world-class historian. Margaret Alexander is one of a kind.